Yes.
Professor Contreras, before we pick up where we left yesterday, I understand you might want to add a little more to what you were telling us yesterday afternoon about the educational work that was undertaken at the centre.
Yes, it was the. Thank you very much for allowing me to say that. But I think it's important. We published together with the National Blood Services in England, Wales, and Scotland, published what is the successor to Notes on Transfusion that you showed in, for 1973, and that was more updated and expanded on appropriate use of blood and safe blood, etc., on clinical transfusion medicine. And we also published, mostly from North London, but also with the collaboration of colleagues in the UK Blood Services and clinicians, the ABC of transfusion. That was a book edited by me and published by the BMJ and distributed by BPL to all hospitals so that they, for free to all hospitals, so that they were aware of the risks of transfusion and transfusion medicine.
And in relation to that second publication, the ABC, can you recall roughly when that was?
The first edition was 1989-1990.
And then the update on Notes on Transfusion, we've certainly looked at one version of that. I can't remember whether it was called the Handbook on Transfusion or something like that.
Yeah, the handbook.
From 1988. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
So if we then pick matters up in relation to the issue of AIDS and issues relating to leaflets and questionnaires, where we left off yesterday afternoon, you told us, as at October 1984, your centre essentially printed over the text of the original leaflet because you were still waiting for the Department of Health to issue the updated leaflet.
Yes.
If we can then look at the circular regarding the updated leaflet that the Department of Health issued in 85, DHSC 0002159, please. So we can see this is dated January 1985. Paragraphs 2 and 3, paragraph 2 refers to the previous version. Paragraph 3 explains that the leaflet's now been revised, most significantly in extending the high-risk groups who should not donate blood, and the opportunity has been taken to amend the layout and update factual matters. And then paragraph 4 sets out revised distribution arrangements. Ministers have decided that it is essential that the revised leaflet be brought to the attention of each donor on an individual basis. This would normally be achieved by sending each donor a copy of the leaflet with his next call-up notification. It's realised this may not be practicable for industrial sessions or for new donors presenting at sessions. In these cases, alternative arrangements should be made to ensure that each donor is individually given the leaflet before any blood is taken. Can you recall what the arrangement was at the centre in relation to this new leaflet in 1985 to ensure that it was brought to the attention of each donor?
Well, unfortunately, we could not comply. You know, these rules are made by people who are not at the sharp end of blood centres. And unfortunately, we could not comply with the recommendation of sending the leaflet to every donor. As I said yesterday, we were sending postcards to donors, and that was our way of reminding them of the donor session. And we educated our donor attendants and receptionists on handing the leaflet, but I cannot say with certainty that it was handed to every single donor, I'm afraid.
As I understand it, Dr. Hewitt had some involvement in relation to, around this time, in relation in particular to issues regarding donor selection, so it may be that she'll be able to assist in that regard. Could we then just look briefly at what I understand to be a third version of the departmental leaflet issued in September of 1985, CBLA 0002255. We see the date at the bottom of the first page of the leaflet, September 1985. And then if we look at the text on this page, we can see that the risk group in relation to being gay is now identified not as practicing or as having many partners, but simply being homosexual or bisexual. And then we have the addition of being a sexual contact of any of these people. If we go to page 3, please. Just going to draw your attention to the question, how is AIDS transmitted? The transmission of AIDS is not yet fully understood, but it's known that one means of transmitting the disease is through blood and blood products. Because of this, all blood donations are now being tested for antibody to the AIDS virus, but people in the groups most likely to be at risk from AIDS still must not give blood, in the last 4 words in capitals. Now, that's obviously one means of ensuring that those who were donating blood understood that their blood would be tested, that their donation would be tested for in relation to HIV. Do you know whether, in addition to providing the leaflet to donors, donors were individually told that their blood was going to be tested?
Yes, they were told, and they had to sign that the blood was going to be individually tested. And in addition, we still had the self-exclusion questionnaire in isolation. So they knew that they were at risk, and they knew that they were going to be tested.
And we'll look at a document too in relation
if they
to
were
that.
at risk.
And then if we just look at the question, can donors get AIDS by giving blood? The leaflet said absolutely not. Neither AIDS nor any other disease can be contracted from giving blood. Do you recall whether that was a concern that was voiced by donors or prospective donors within the area served by your centre, a fear that somehow by giving blood they could contract AIDS?
Oh yes, it was. There was a shortage of blood in the world, not only, because I had contacts and because I'm foreign as well, there was a shortage of blood in the UK, nationally, and in other countries, like the USA and Europe, in European countries. And we didn't know what to do. And I remember I said, who could I call who is a public figure? And I thought of Princess Diana at the time, but she was too slim, and I don't think she was the right person. And I asked Prince Charles to come and donate. And it took me a long time to get Buckingham Palace to allow me for him to come. And he came and gave his blood at Edgware. And he was in all the newspapers. And it's amazing how our blood stocks increased, not only in England, but in other countries. I got letters from lots of parts in the world saying thank you, because it went around the world, him giving his blood, showing that he was giving his blood.
I was trying to work out, Professor Contreras, when that might have been, and I found, I think, a newspaper article in the Los Angeles Times, which would perhaps indicate the international attention, suggesting that that donation was given by Prince Charles at the centre on the 1st of March 1985. And it quotes you saying that he was invited to donate blood in an effort to allay public fears about AIDS, and in the hope the visit would encourage other people. And it had that effect, did it?
It had more or less an immediate effect.
Now, if we can then just look at NHBT 0092834, please. This is minutes of the meeting of the Eastern Division Consultants, 3rd of October 1985, and you were in attendance. If we could just look down the bottom of the page, under the heading AIDS, it says each centre was using their own version of an updated 110 form, which were in the process of being printed. And then the bottom of the page says the new AIDS leaflet was criticised, and most centres were sending an, and then we go over the page, explanatory letter in addition the most worrying aspect of the leaflet was that it implied that anti-HTLV3 was a test for AIDS. Do you recall that being an issue of concern?
I can't recall.
And then if we just look at the next heading, under the heading Blood Collection and Donor Recruitment, it records Dr Darnborough saying that the publicity budget had been increased to £350,000. Dr Darnborough was which transfusion centre?
Cambridge.
And then it says, you said this was still grossly inadequate. It was generally agreed it should be put to the advisory committee via the RTD meeting that a larger proportion of available money should go to the London centres. Now, in terms of the publicity budget, was that a nationally allocated budget from the Department of Health?
Yes, and managed nationally as
well. Why was it, if you can recall, that you thought that was grossly inadequate?
It was very little money. For example, we couldn't advertise on television or on national radio. It was mostly for printing posters and leaflets, and a little bit of local advertising. But it's not like now when they're appealing for blood in the radio daily.
Now, just in relation to the exclusion questionnaire that you told us about, so that we can put some dates in relation to that, can we look at JPAC 40140_143, please? Yeah, JPAC 40140_, sorry, it's 043, my fault, Shemik. This is a summary of a later publication from 1992. It's headed Confidential Unit Exclusion, the North London Blood Transfusion Centre's Experience. And then it records that a confidential AIDS questionnaire has been in use in North London Blood Transfusion Centre donor sessions since July 1985. The purpose of the questionnaire is to encourage those donors whose behaviour puts them at risk of HIV infection to refrain from donating. In a situation where such individuals cannot avoid donating, they can indicate in confidence that their blood should not be used for transfusion. And then it goes on to describe the process. Now, other documents indicate, and I think it's consistent with what you told us yesterday, Professor Contreras, that you introduced this in July 1984 in one centre,
yes,
as it were on a trial basis, and then this would suggest it was rolled out across the remaining donor sessions a year later. Is that right?
Yes. First at the plasmapheresis clinics, and then to the sessions.
Can you recall why it was a year before it was rolled out to the other centres or other sessions?
To the donor, because it was very difficult to find sessions that were large enough. You know, if we had to do it, we had to do it uniformly across all donor sessions, and sometimes we couldn't find a place for our screens to screen. You need some donor sessions are very tight, so until we were assured that we could do it, it took some time.
Because it's right to understand, I think, that at this point in time, July 1985, testing of donations has not yet been introduced. That happens in October 1985. Yeah. So donor selection processes trying to deter high-risk donors or prevent high-risk donors from donating was essentially the only tool that you had at that point. And do you recall whether other regional transfusion centres, whether in your division or nationally, introduced a similar measure or gave any thought to introducing a similar measure?
I don't think they did, but I'm not quite sure.
And then if we could look, please, at NHBT 5030_013. This is an article published in the British Medical Journal in March of 1985, authored by you, Dr. Hewitt, Dr. Barbara, and a scientific officer at the centre. If we look at the heading comment, bottom of the left-hand column, so there's reference there to one of the published papers. I'm not going to ask you to go through the details of that, but if you go to the top of the next column then, this records that donors in the high-risk category said that they had continued to donate despite the publicity about AIDS, because the original unrevised leaflet had implied that homosexuals with stable partnerships were still eligible as donors. And then, last paragraph, it's alarming that some male homosexuals still donate blood, and it is vital that all possible measures are taken to discourage this. So is it right to understand that your findings at the centre, which are discussed in a little more detail in this paper that I'm going to go through, it indicated that the original leaflet hadn't deterred all high-risk donors because of the reason that they thought it didn't cover them?
Yes.
Professor Contreras, oh, no, actually, before I move on, let's just look at, I think, two versions of the questionnaire, just to get a sense of what you were introducing. PRSE 301398, please. So we can see this is headed National Blood Transfusion Service, North London Blood Transfusion Centre, and then the text is, Dear donor, because of the current concern about the disease age, which can be transmitted by blood products, we're asking all our donors at each attendance to complete the enclosed questionnaire in order to try and reduce this risk to a minimum. So this appears to be a covering letter. And then it says, after booking, would you please, 1, read the AIDS leaflet, 2, enter the side room on the left as you approach the main clinic, 1 donor at a time, 3, complete your questionnaire in confidence, 4, post it in the special box provided, 5, take a seat outside ready to enter the main clinic and donate. So this is the document with the questionnaire that would be provided at the sessions to the individual donors.
Yes, yeah. But this is not the questionnaire.
No, it refers to the questionnaire. Yeah. So I thought we had a copy of the questionnaire, but I'm not sure that we do. And then there's a further document, a later one, I think, NHBT 00851139_007. So this post dates October 1985 because it refers in the second paragraph to the blood being tested. But it explains AIDS is a very serious disease caused by a virus, HIV. And then there is no risk of catching AIDS through blood donation, but HIV can be passed on to a patient by the transfusion of infected blood. It is therefore very important that you read and understand what is said in the AIDS leaflet each time before you donate. Your blood will be tested for HIV. It is possible for the test to be negative in the early stages of infection. All donors are therefore asked to read this form and complete it carefully. All information will be kept strictly confidential. You must not give blood. And then there are a range of different exclusions there set out. Now, I don't think we have a date on this document, but it's sometime in the second half of the 1980s, I think, because the issue about having had sex at any time since 1977 with men or women who live or have lived in African countries, I think is discussed at various meetings in the second half of the 80s. But this is the kind of document, is it, that was being provided by way of questionnaire to donors at the centre?
Yes, but that was not the self-exclusion questionnaire.
And then, well, it looks like this might have been a later version of the self-exclusion questionnaire, Professor Contreras, because if we look at the very bottom of the page, it says, please fold this form and place in the box provided.
Yes, sorry, yes.
Yeah, so this is sometime in the second half of the 80s, this is what was provided, okay.
Yes, sorry.
What I want to do next, Professor, is move on to the question of screening, testing of blood donations for HIV. Can we look, first of all, before we go into the detail of that, at your witness statement, WITN 5711001, and go to page 36. So paragraph 139 at the top of the page, you are here being asked a general question about the decision-making remit, for example, of regional transfusion director meetings. And you say this in relation to decision-making generally. With respect to the running of the centre and meeting demands for products and services as well as for R&D, those decisions were made by me and my management team. So at a local level, we made our own decisions with the regional health authority as the overall body overseeing this. With respect to national standards, these were agreed by consensus at the regional transfusion directors' meetings. And then you say this, Professor, decisions on the national introduction of screening tests for blood donations were made by the Department of Health. Now, I'm not going to suggest to you, Professor Contreras, that you're inaccurate in what you say there about decisions being made about national introduction of screening by the Department of Health. What I wanted to try and understand is why it was that that category of decision was taken by the Department of Health rather than being an issue for regional transfusion directors to decide for themselves.
As I understand it, it's because we were a national service, although we were regionally managed and we did things different regionally, but there were matters of great importance, like the screening, that it was preferable that every patient in the country received the same type of screened blood for as many agents as were possible. But this needed funding as well from the Department of Health. And so the Department of Health had to more or less instruct and inform regions that a new test was being introduced.
Now, you're in relation to funding for screening for HTLV3, HIV, your understanding is that was provided nationally by the Department of Health?
That's my understanding.
That, as we see when we get on later in the day to the introduction of screening for hepatitis C, that wasn't funded by the Department of Health, was it?
That's correct. It wasn't.
Themselves through their regional health authorities. Can I just explore with you the different types of decisions that might need to be made in relation to the introduction of screening? And this is a general discussion, Professor Contreras, before we look at the specifics of the decision-making in relation to testing for HIV or testing for hepatitis C or indeed surrogate testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis. So there's a decision in principle, should we introduce screening in relation to this condition? Would you accept that?
Yes.
There's then the question of how that's going to be paid for.
Yes.
There's the question of what form the screening will take, what particular tests to use, what arrangements, practical arrangements need to be made.
Yes.
And then there's the question of what the actual date for implementation will be.
Yes.
Was it your understanding that all of those decisions, all of those different categories of decision effectively fell to be taken by the Department of Health, albeit with regional transfusion directors and Dr. Gunson expressing views or making recommendations?
I don't think that all those, the department had a great influence in those, but the decision of whether we would test or not test was a department. It could have had advice from the blood services, but the testing on to test or not to test was a decision from the department. And then the details of what tests to use, we would do the kit evaluation test assays and then recommend a certain test. And I cannot remember, I think it was also, it went to the department, to that advisory committee, and then from there to the department.
Now, if we leave aside for a moment the question of funding, was there in principle anything to stop a regional transfusion centre, obviously with the approval of its regional health authority, introducing screening at a time of its choosing?
No, apart from the fact that the conscience of the director and his or her team to give blood that's screened compared with the rest of the country. But
we'll probably pick that issue up when we look at the introduction of hepatitis C screening. Okay, well, let's look then at the introduction of screening in relation to HIV. I'm not going to go through each and every stage of the decision-making process. I'm just going to look at a handful of documents which indicate the involvement of either you or the centre. So if we start at CBLA 0001914_007, we can see here a document dated November 1984, Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service Working Group on AIDS. And then paragraph 1 explains that a working group on AIDS has been set up with the following terms of reference to consider the implications for the National Blood Transfusion Service of testing blood donations for antibody to HTLV3 and to report. And then we have a number of members set out, including you, Professor Contreras, a couple of co-opted members, observers from Department of Health, Welsh Office, Scottish Home and Health Department, Dr McClelland from the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, and then the Secretariat being provided by officials from the Department of Health, Dr Smithers and Mr Williams. Can you recall whose idea it was to set this up? Was this a Dr Gunson or RTD initiative, or was it a Department of Health initiative?
I don't recall.
And what can you recall about the purpose of this working group, other than what we see set out in paragraph 1 in terms of the terms of reference? What was it that this group was actually going to be doing?
I think it's what it states there, to consider the implications of testing for anti-HTLV3 or anti-HIV, as it happened to be.
And can you recall whether the plan was that this group would make recommendations that would then be considered by the Department of Health?
Yes.
Can we then look at DHSC 0001677, please? If we go to page 2, we've got a letter from Dr Gunson to Dr Smithers, July 1984. We looked at this yesterday because one of the documents attached was about the organisation of the National Blood Transfusion Service. But if we go to the next page, what we have here is a document, perhaps if we go to over the page, we can see the authorship first of all. So authored by Dr Gunson, copied to a number of people, including you. The document itself is not dated, unfortunately, but if we go back to the preceding page, there's a plan set out. If we look at the first 3 paragraphs, stage 1 is the sending of samples from the North West Thames Regional Transfusion Centre, so that's your transfusion centre, to the Middlesex Hospital, where performance of the test will be proved and evaluated. Stage 2, performance of the test will be transferred to the North West Thames Regional Transfusion Centre and experience gained on its use. And then stage 3 was donations being tested at Manchester, Bristol, and continuing at the North London Centre. Do you have any recollection now of what work was undertaken at the North London Centre in terms of evaluating or contributing to the evaluation of the HTLV3 tests?
Yes, I can vaguely remember that the microbiology laboratory was the first one to do the screening tests on these donations. It was the first generation assay, and we sent the repeatedly reactive samples to Professor Tedder at the Middlesex.
Okay. So the work that was being undertaken by the North London Centre in that regard would have been under the auspices of Dr. Barbara?
Yes.
So, well, no doubt we can ask him hopefully in relation to that. Now, this is probably not a question you're going to be able to answer without looking at lots and lots of documents. Can you recall when the North London Centre was involved in the evaluations? Did it start in 1984 or was it later in 1985?
I cannot know.
Can we then pick matters up then in March of 1985 at PRSE 0004824? You'll see, Professor, this is the Lancet, 2nd of March 1985. If we go to the second page, right-hand column, about halfway down the page, there's a letter there signed, sorry, if we can have the list of names. So we can see it's signed by a number of regional transfusion directors. We looked at this with Dr. Napier, whose name appears, and we can see that your name is there as well, Professor Contreras. And then if we look at the text of the letter, it refers to believing that the current commercial kits for HTLV3 antibody tests are likely to give a high rate of false positive results. Again, I don't know whether this is something you can remember without looking through lots of underlying documents. Do you recall what the evidential basis was for the concern that the tests were likely to give a high rate of false positive results?
Yes, that I remember. It was for approximately 10 initially reactive or positives on the screening test. We found one confirmed positive by Professor Tedder.
And then you go on to say, we would therefore recommend that careful consideration be given before they're introduced for the screening of all voluntary blood donors. But the amount of and degree of unnecessary stress and hardship that a fair number of our donors and their families would thus have to undergo is unacceptable. So concern there about the impact of false positives on donors, is that right?
Yes.
This in turn could lead to a sizable drop in the supply of blood and blood products. So there are concern about the impact upon the blood transfusion service. And then the next point, the third point that's made, described as being for the safety of transfused patients, is that there should be essentially GUM clinics in the community where ordinary members of the population could get tested so that they don't donate blood for the specific purpose of getting tested. Is that right?
Yes.
And again, was there an evidential basis for that concern, or was that just a fear that it might happen?
In the USA, they called it the magnet effect. Our colleagues in the USA who had started to test had evidence that people in high-risk groups for transmitting HIV were giving blood in order to know whether they were positive or negative.
And so the next paragraph says, we do support strongly the screening of all blood donors for HTLV3 antibody testing, but we would advise that this is delayed until test systems have been appropriately evaluated and efforts have been made to give all members of the public access to HTLV3 antibody testing. Now, in relation to those 2 points in that last paragraph, evaluation of test systems and providing public access, can we just take those separately?
And providing, sorry?
Public access to testing. In terms of providing public access to testing, whose responsibility would it be essentially to ensure that was available? Was that a Department of Health responsibility?
I believe Department of Health asking regions to introduce alternative test sites.
And do you have any knowledge or recollection yourself of what efforts were made by the Department of Health, or what steps were taken and when in that regard?
I've read lots of documents that were sent to me by the inquiry, and I believe I saw a memorandum or a letter to regional general managers to introduce alternative testing clinics. And I think they said that this best could be done at GUM clinics.
And do you recall whether you or your colleagues, either your colleagues at the centre or your colleagues at other centres, do you recall whether you thought the Department of Health was moving quickly enough in that regard, or whether you had concerns that it was taking too long to sort out?
I think in some areas it took too long to be set out. I think that my region acted quite promptly in establishing, in offering HTLV3 testing. But there were parts of the country, I remember some of my transfusion director colleagues, and I think that in Scotland as well, it took some time for GUM clinics to be tested, alternative sites.
And then the other point that you've made in this last paragraph, you and your colleagues made in this last paragraph, was about the need for the test systems to be appropriately evaluated. Can we just go, please, to PRSC 0002078? This is a letter of the 30th of July of 1985 from the Department of Health to regional general managers, regional medical officers, regional transfusion directors and others. It may be that this is the document you were referring to a few moments ago, Professor Contreras. So it says in the first paragraph, in his press release dated the 27th of June, the Minister for Health announced that a test would be introduced to screen all blood given by blood donors for antibodies to the virus which causes AIDS. Arrangements would also be made for sexually transmitted disease clinics to provide a test for people who fear they may have been exposed to the disease. So this reads at least as though that's an announcement being made June, July of 1985. Do you know of any reason why that couldn't have been done earlier?
No.
And then the next paragraph of this letter talks about the evaluation of the tests. First stage of the evaluation of commercially available test kits has now been completed on behalf of DHSS by the Public Health Laboratory Service. The outcome of that evaluation has been considered by a panel of experts. A summary of their recommendations is attached. The National Blood Transfusion Service is now taking its own second stage evaluation, covering aspects peculiar to the use of kits in the blood donation screening context. So we've got there a two-stage evaluation, with the second stage essentially only commencing in the summer of 1985. Again, do you know why it took until the summer of 1985 for that second stage evaluation to be initiated?
No, but I think it was too late.
And just in terms of some dates, I'm not going to go to the detailed subsequent evaluation report, but I'll just give the reference for the transcript. It's PRSC 302716, but it shows the North London Centre was one of the centres involved in that second stage evaluation. And as I understand it at that point, what was being done in the North London Centre and I think Manchester was a comparison between different tests. So there was a testing or evaluation of the Wellcome test and then of the Organon test. Yeah. Do you know what we see here is the evaluation being done sequentially. In other words, you've got the PHLS and then the evaluation being undertaken by yourselves and Manchester. Could that have been done simultaneously?
I don't think so, because what the PHLS did was look at sensitivity and specificity, but also at doability, at the length of that test took. So some tests are good for diagnostic purposes in diagnostic laboratories, but some tests are good for screening. So in screening donations, you need sensitivity and specificity in order to get the right donors positive. With diagnostic testing, you try to get as much sensitivity as possible. So, and the length, with diagnosis, it doesn't matter very much if you have a test taking 3 or 6 hours, but with blood donations, if you're giving platelets. So there are several reasons why you should assess which tests are convenient for the transfusion service, and then hand those ones to the testing laboratories in the blood services.
But although it might have involved more work for your centre under the auspices of Dr. Barbara or Manchester or other centres to do it, as it were, simultaneously, is there any reason why there couldn't have been an evaluation of the practical implications, as it were, looking at all the diagnostic tests, whilst PHLS was doing its own evaluation from its perspective? Did it have to wait until PHLS had narrowed it down to 2 tests, in other words?
Yes, it had to wait, because we couldn't have been comparing, a test that took too long with a test that was shorter. They had to choose what was adequate for us, for the blood services. But it could have been done quicker.
If we just then, if I can ask you to have in mind, again, that March 1985 Lancet letter, we can put it back on screen if we need to, but what I want to do, and some questions I've been asked to ask you, is to look at what Dr. Gunson was asked about that letter in his oral evidence in the Hepatitis C and National Blood Authority litigation, and ask you to comment on that. So NHBT 40148_001, please. So this is an extract from Dr. Gunson's testimony. If we could go, please, to page 4. Just going to read, starting from the 3rd line, I'm going to read the passages and then ask you about it. So this is a letter written this is part of the question that's being put to him. This is a letter written in March 1985, just over 6 months before screening was actually introduced. Is that right? Answer, this is the Arla, that's a reference to Dr. Arla, et al. Letter. Question, yes, it is just over 6 months before screening for HIV is introduced. Answer, yes. It is about the time that other countries, France, America, Australia, the list we looked at yesterday, are in fact introducing screening. Answer, indeed. Question, the signatures are probably all the 14 or however many it is regional transfusion directors. Answer, it's not all of them. Question, it's most of them. Answer, they're all transfusion centre directors in either England or Scotland. And then there's a question about the false positives. So there's a quote from the Lancet letter, and at line 173, the question is, was that in fact the case? Dr. Gunson says there were false positive. Question, was it a high rate? Answer, I'm not sure at this time now whether you would describe it as a high rate, which is a rather indefinite adjective to put before it. And then if we can see the rest of the page, please, thank you. Question, so this is line 179. There's then another quote from the letter. We would therefore recommend that careful consideration be, I'm not sure what it is, probably given, before they are introduced for the screening of all voluntary donors for the amount and degree of unnecessary stress and hardship that a fair number of our donors and their families will thus have to undergo is unacceptable. This in turn could lead to a sizable drop in supply. So there's the quote, Professor, from the March letter. And then the question continues, the importance of the supply is then stressed. Then the problems of the clinics, by which I mean the blood clinics, blood donation clinics, having to do the work, really what they were looking for was a different body to do the counselling. Answer, yes. Just pausing there, can you recall whether that was part of your thinking, that external support in relation to the counselling was required?
No, because we had, at least what I recall in my centre, we had a team of doctors that dealt with the counselling, and they went to St. Mary's Hospital to, it's not the collection teams that were going to be doing the counselling, it's a group of experts at the centre.
But the position may have been different in relation to other centres.
It may have been different.
And then line 192, that's you and your co-authors of the letter, conclude, we do support strongly the screening, but we would advise that this is, I think it must be delayed until test systems have been appropriately evaluated. And then the question continues, I simply wanted you to comment, here we are with a much more serious condition, I think that's a comparison of HIV and hepatitis C that's being referred to there. Other countries already introducing, but directors being primarily apparently concerned about problems for donors and for practicalities within clinics. Is that a fair comment? And if we go to the next page, answer, yes. I think the transfusion service is concerned with the health and welfare of their donors. Question, there's not any mention there about, as it were, the possible impact upon recipients, is there? Answer, well, it does say we do support strongly the screening of all blood donors. Question, we are going to delay. There is no, as it were, weighing up on the one hand the disadvantage of a donor being told, perhaps wrongly, that he had AIDS, and on the other hand, a recipient getting AIDS while you delay. There is no balancing exercise done in that letter, is there? Answer, in this letter, there is not, no. So you'll see from that exchange, Professor, that what was being explored with Dr. Gunson was whether that March 1985 letter was essentially concerned with the impact upon donors and blood service in terms of the arrangements that would have to be made or loss of supplies, and insufficiently weighing into the balance the risks to the recipients of blood. Do you have any observations or comments to make upon that?
No, I wish that with hindsight, but I wouldn't have known what to tell those 9 donors that I couldn't confirm, I would have created an army of worried well. There are people who, if they're told that they've got something like cancer or a fatal infection, they might throw themselves in front of the tube or anything. So it was those considerations, but perhaps we were wrong.
I think you said, I wish with hindsight.
Yeah.
Do you wish with hindsight that the screening had been introduced earlier than October 1985?
Yes, I wish that there had been a better test, because I had the problem of telling those it's about which of the 1 in 10 was the infectious one, was the one who was transmitting. That was but I wish there had been a better test. It was a test that was done. It was performed, cultured in cells, and lots of women have, young women who have had children have HLA antibodies, and this test was contaminated with HLA tissue antigens. So women having anti-HLA antibodies, that are many, would have tested positive with having a very pure life. So yeah, I wish there had been a better test.
Can I then turn to the specific arrangements that were made in the centre in relation to the introduction of the testing? Can we start by looking at a regional transfusion directors meeting on the 9th of October 1985. So that's about a week before the date set for the introduction of the testing nationally. DHSC 0002365_002. So we've got there the meeting date, 9th of October 1985, and we can see that you, amongst others, were in attendance. If we go to the bottom of the second page, please. We have a heading AIDS update. Picking it up in the second paragraph, anti-HTLV3 screening is in hand and training completed. All RTCs will start full testing by the 14th of October 1985. Discussion took place over fresh blood products in stock, i.e. FFP, cryo and frozen blood. The matter had been raised at divisions and RTCs differed. Some felt they would not support discarding untested donations. Wherever possible, back testing would be carried out on in-date material. It was felt important that BPL should accept and process FFP and time-expired plasma for heat-treated products. Dr. Lane stressed that such material must be clearly identified and BPL given notice. But before we look at the rest of this, is it right, Professor, to understand that although there was the date of 14th of October as the date upon which any donor coming into centres at that point in time, their donation should be tested, that left unresolved and for individual centres to decide what they did about everything that they already had in stock?
Yes.
So that question wasn't nationally mandated, it was left to be determined on a local basis.
Yes.
And we can see here in the fourth line of that paragraph, some directors not wanting to discard untested donations. So it would seem from that in some parts of the country, untested materials may have been supplied to for use in patients after the 14th of October 1985. Is that right?
Yes.
And then we see, and the next paragraph is a contribution from you. Dr. Contreras reported that all accredited donors of frozen red cells for boosting had been screened 5 months ago by a number of tests, and expert opinions were that these were safe to use. What does that refer to?
We had accredited red cells to it's something amazing that donors do, that they accept the Rh rhesus negative or Rh negative volunteers who accept to be boosted with Rh positive, immunized with Rh positive red cells, and in order to produce anti-Rhd or anti-D immunoglobulin. And these donors are injected with red cells regularly so that they maintain a very high level of antibodies. And in this way, we were self-sufficient, this country was self-sufficient in anti-D immunoglobulin to protect Rhd negative mothers from having children affected with hemolytic disease of the fetus or newborn. So this because there were volunteers and they were being injected with Rh positive donor cells, we accredited those red cells. And so we managed to test them, and they were, fortunately, they were all negative for HTLV and all the markers.
But this tends to suggest that as long ago as 5 months before October 1985, there had been some form of HTLV3 testing that you were able to use in relation to this particular category. Is
yes,
that right?
It was the ones that we used in the screening assays, in the kit evaluation tests.
And then there's reference to frozen donations. Many have been stored for years before high-risk donors appeared in the population. Could perhaps testing of these people now clear their previous donations? Do you recall what that referred to and what, if anything, was done in relation to that?
Yes, some centres, including ours, had frozen red cells in glycerol. They're very special red cells. For example, there's a blood group called Bombay that I think we have 1 or 2 subjects in this country, in the UK, in the 56 million population, who are Bombay. So we have to freeze the cells from them, because if they need a transfusion, they die if they get anybody's blood. So, and we had also specially typed cells for people with rare blood groups. Those were frozen, and they could be frozen for 10 years. So the only way to make sure that they were, that those frozen cells were negative, unless they were going to be for an autologous donation, was to contact the donors of those frozen red cells and test them. And if they were not extremely special, they had to be discarded.
And was that what was done at the North London Centre?
Yes.
Do you know the extent to which it was done elsewhere at other centres?
No.
And then if we go to the top of the next page, the first paragraph, it says the role of the department and press releases over the next few weeks was the subject of discussion. Dr. Smithers requested the advice of the meeting, as obviously there would be much press interest. Directors were concerned that in spite of publicity, high-risk persons were still coming to donor sessions in order to find out their HTLV3 antibody status. Many groups have made it clear they will not attend STD clinics or GPs, and most districts have not made clear arrangements for persons to have ready access to testing. And then this, Dr. Contreras reported her findings that GPs did not have clear instructions. Can you recall what that refers to?
I don't recall clearly, but we had quite a lot of communication with GPs through Dr. Hewitt's department. And I think that many of them said, no, we haven't received any instructions about HIV.
And the responsibility to ensure that GPs or other clinicians outside of transfusion centres were fully aware of what was happening and able to offer whatever services were required, that would be the responsibility, would it, of the regional health authorities and or the Department of Health?
Yeah.
That's not something over which the regional transfusion directors would have direct control?
No, we had no control over GPs. Just contact with some of them.
And then if we could please next go to BPLL 001 0763. This is a letter you wrote in February 1986 to Dr. Snape at BPL. You say in the first paragraph, we commenced total anti-HTLV3 screening of our donor panel on the 23rd of September 1985. From that date on, all donors will have been screened for anti-HTLV3. So is it correct then that, in fact, you at North London didn't wait for the nationally agreed date? You brought testing forward by, I think, 3 weeks.
3 weeks, yeah.
And why was that?
We were not the only ones, because we had the facility to do it, and because we knew that we had to issue HIV, anti-HTLV3 negative blood by a certain date. So, and I think that there were other centres who did the same as us.
So because you were ready, you decided to go a little earlier than the national date?
Yeah, in order to have everything screened on the date that we were going to tell the public blood is tested, but we were not going to tell them the blood that we're giving today is negative.
And then if we look at NHBT 0057018_001, this is on the same topic. This is a letter 29th of October 1985 to Dr. Smithers at the Department of Health. And if we can just look at the second paragraph, you say, we were able to start anti-HTLV3 screening unofficially from the 23rd of September 1985. Since we rarely have the luxury of too much blood gathering dust in the fridge, and since our supplies of fresh frozen plasma get snapped up very quickly, our only stored material is cryoprecipitate. We've been storing serum samples from donors for several months now. We're going through the records of our cryoprecipitate stocks to check which stored donor samples correspond to the stocked material. In addition, we'll be able to test those cryoprecipitate donors who return to give further donations, so this problem is in hand. So what you are, as I understand it, there describing a situation in which, perhaps because of the location of the centre and the number of hospitals you serve, you didn't carry large numbers of stock that would be untested.
Yeah, most of our stock was in the hospitals, and as you've seen in other documents, I think that was sent to me, although we were collecting much more per thousand population than the rest of the country, the demand was so high that it rotated very quickly. So only had cryo to.
And do you know what the position was in other centres, whether they had larger stocks of untested material than you did?
I do not know, but I think that I've seen a letter there that at least one centre did the same thing that we did.
And then you referred a few moments ago to the fact that a lot of your stock would actually not be being held in the centre. It would have been supplied to the hospitals, so the hospitals would have stocks of blood products that, as at the 14th of October 1985, may not be tested.
Yeah, like fresh frozen plasma, for example, and if they had that, we asked them to return it.
But can we just look at a couple of letters? In fact, I think we probably only need to look at one letter. DHSC 0101818. This is a letter you wrote in October 1985 to all consultant haematologists re anti-HTLV3 testing of blood donations. You'll probably have heard that the date for the introduction of routine anti-HTLV3 testing of all blood donations has been announced as October the 14th. All blood donations taken on or after that date will undergo routine anti-HTLV3 testing, and no blood or blood components taken on or after that date will be released in advance of a negative anti-HTLV3 test, with one exception. And then you describe the exception, as I understand it, in the next sentence. The logistics of anti-HTLV3 testing combined with rapid release of fresh components, in particular platelets, are such that it will be difficult to continue our present practice of same-day release. We're trying our best to circumvent the problems, but the anti-HTLV3 test is more time-consuming than other routine tests currently performed. And then you go on to explain that platelets may not effectively be released on the same day for that reason. Next paragraph, we've severely run down stocks of FFP and cryoprecipitate over the last month in anticipation of the start of testing. It's impossible to retrospectively test all stock currently held at the RTC, but field trials of the anti-HTLV3 tests have been carried out over the last few weeks, and a large proportion of the current stock of blood has already been tested. And then you say there will be no facility for return of untested blood or components, but it's anticipated that the overlap period will be short, except in the case of rare blood held as frozen units of red cells, which I think is the example you gave us a few minutes ago. So what was the expectation as to what hospitals holding untested stock should do with that, given that you say here there wasn't a facility for returning it?
I'm afraid it might have been if they had untested blood. We later on accepted fresh frozen plasma and sent it as time expired plasma, but for the production of PPF or albumin. But I'm afraid that they would have been considered as perhaps suitable for transfusion.
So after the 14th of October 1985, hospitals may have been using, to treat patients, products that had not been tested.
Yeah, very few, but yeah.
Do you know whether other centres operated any facility for return of untested blood or blood products?
I do not know.
I'm going to ask you now to consider, we can take that down, thank you, the issue of surrogate testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis. And just so that those who are following, and indeed I'm clear about what we mean by surrogate testing, until the late 1980s, and we'll come on to this later, there was no test which could, as it were, directly test for hepatitis C. And so surrogate testing refers to an indirect means of identifying donors who may be infected. Is that
Yes.
fair summary? And there were two surrogate markers relevant in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis, raised ALTs or antibody to hepatitis B core, anti-HBC. Is that right?
Yes.
And you could, in principle, test both for ALT and anti-HBC, or you could test for one or the other.
Yes.
Is it also right to understand that in the 1980s, there wasn't a universal picture across other countries as to what they did, but some countries used surrogate testing in the course of the 1980s. Indeed, I think Germany had been using ALT testing for a couple of decades.
Yes.
And we'll see when we look at some documents that testing for both of those markers was introduced in the USA in 1986.
Yes.
It wasn't introduced in the UK, was it, in the course of the 1980s at all?
No, it wasn't.
Now, if we can then look at a handful of documents, again, ones which reflect meetings to which you contributed or letters which you wrote on this issue. I'm not going to go through the entirety of decision-making or aspects of it that you weren't involved in. But again, going back to some of the general questions I asked you earlier, whose decision did you regard it as being as to whether surrogate testing should be introduced? Department of Health, regional transfusion directors, regional health authorities? Who would be taking that decision?
Department of Health.
And would that be because you would be looking to the Department of Health for funding, or would it be for some other reason?
I think for, especially for funding, but also for uniformity across the UK.
Can we look then, first of all, at an article in 1984? It's at LHBT 5030_008. So we can see the date of publication. I don't think we have the precise date, in fact, but it's 1984 in any event. And it's entitled Necessary Tests on Blood Donations to Detect Infectious Agents. You explain in the first paragraph that transmission of infectious agents is a major hazard of blood transfusion. And then you go on to talk about the approach that could be taken in relation to screening and to identify a number of factors. If we go on to page 3, we can see the heading non-A, non-B hepatitis. You say there are most cases of hepatitis non-A, non-B are mild or asymptomatic. There is no general agreement about the severity of the acute illness or its long-term effects. We discussed that yesterday, Professor Contreras, so I'm not going to ask you about that again. There are no specific serological markers for the agents of non-A, non-B hepatitis. There is an epidemiological association between HBV and non-A, non-B hepatitis. It has been estimated that up to a 50% reduction in non-A, non-B TTH, so transfusion-transmitted hepatitis, could be achieved by eliminating units from donors with markers for past HBV infection. This measure could mean a 2 to 4% rejection of units. In the absence of prospective randomized trials, no general recommendations can be made regarding routine use of anti-HBC tests. Now, you're dealing there, as I understand it, simply with anti-HBC and not with ALT testing.
Yeah, I should have dealt with ALT as well.
And the last sentence of that paragraph would appear to suggest that your view was that a recommendation couldn't be made in the absence of further trials, prospective randomized trials.
Yes, in each country, for each country, yes.
And why did you think it was important to have prospective randomized trials?
To see whether there was, whether the incidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis was higher in recipients, like the TTV study in the United States, to see whether there was a higher incidence of non-A, non-B in people who retrospectively tested positive for anti-hepatitis B core, because this was up to 50%, but different countries had different estimations.
So the purpose of the trials that you're talking, or that you were envisaging could be undertaken here, would be to establish what the extent of the problem for an individual nation of non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
What was the purpose of saying there needed to be these trials as at 1984? Because you wanted to understand, or you thought it was important for a country to understand the extent of non-A, non-B hepatitis in its population?
Of post-transfusion non-A, non-B hepatitis in the population. We did not know what the problem was in this country. With an all-volunteer donor, and we did not know whether we had the same problem as the United States had, or I think Spain, and I think there were some trials done in France as well, in Toulouse, but we did not know whether there was a correlation between anticore or ALT testing and reduction of transmission in this country.
Now, I'm going to pick up what happened in the second half of the 80s, perhaps after the break. But as at 1984, in the first half of the 1980s, can you recall what, if any, studies were undertaken involving the North London Centre?
We did studies of anticoronary and ALT, but to see what the prevalence was in blood donors, and it was much lower than the United States. But we did not do studies of transmissibility then. And this paper must have been written in 1983. As I said in my statement. I don't think I wrote it in 1984.
I'm going to then pick matters up in 1986, but I note the time, sir, so perhaps we take the break now and then I can do that after the break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until 11:45. 11:45.